Study what God has revealed to us in his words is that we'd be focused on his things, the greater things, the things he's set in place for us, the things he wants to teach and to tell us. We'll be doing that this morning as we continue looking at the story of Nehemiah. If you've got a Bible and want to follow along, we'll primarily be in Nehemiah chapter 2 this morning. And while you're turning there, and in case you weren't here last week, I just want to catch you up. To give us the context again of what's taken place so far in Israel's history that predated the book of Nehemiah, and then what happened in chapter 1 that we saw last week. The Old Testament is filled with a couple thousand years of the people of God's history, and particularly then the Israelites, as they're come to be known, have four things that they're really looking for to know that God is well with them, that God is serving them, that it is alongside them, he's in their midst. Four covenants that God has made over those thousands of years. The first of those is a covenant that he made with his people, that they would live together, that they could have right relationship with each other. We call that covenant the law, that God told us how we would live in relationship with God. And so one of the things that the people of God were always hoping would be in place is God's law and the ability to practice it. And secondly, we saw that God then promised to Abraham a land, the promised land it's called, that the people would then inherit and live in. That's the second thing, that the people would be present in the land that God had promised them. Thirdly, he had made a covenant with them that he would live in their midst in the temple that they would build at the place he designated for them. That ended up being in Jerusalem, that the people of God would build the temple and that would be where God would dwell in their midst. And then lastly, God covenanted with them through David that there would always be a king on the throne in the line of David. Four pillars that the people of God always wanted to see in place to know that their relationship with God was going as he had covenanted and promised that it would. And through most of history after they get into the promised land, those things are in place. There's some controversy around some of them, but by and large, all four of those things are in place. History takes a dramatic turn, though, about 100 or so years before the book of Nehemiah. In 586 BC, the Babylonian people come to fight and take over the promised land. They end up destroying the Israelites, kicking them out of land, knocking down the walls of Jerusalem, and bringing the temple to rubble. It doesn't exist anymore, and the people have been kicked out of the land. And there's a short season of about 50 years where none of the four pillars are in place. The people still have the scrolls of the law. Many of them have memorized it. But there's no functional way for them to live it out. There's no altar for them to make sacrifices on. There's no high priest that they can designate and know where they're supposed to go to live out the law. The walls have been destroyed. They've been kicked out of the land. The temple's in rubble and ruin. And the king has been captured and ultimately will die. None of the four pillars present. 50 years or so later, in 539 BC, the Persians come to defeat the Babylonians, and their king at the time, King Cyrus, gives a decree that the people of God are allowed to come back and live in the area of Jerusalem again. And so a remnant of them return. And upon returning, their hope and their goal is to reestablish those four pillars. They begin by building an altar so that they can live out the covenant God has made through the law again. And then around 520 BC, Zerubbabel leads in rebuilding the temple so that God's presence could be in their midst again. It takes about 4 years or so, and by about 516 BC, that second temple has been built. And so the covenant with God's people through the law and the temple are both present, but they're still missing the king, and they're still missing their boundaries within the promised land, their ownership of any of that land. 70 years pass. And none of that's been rebuilt. And Nehemiah, who's serving the Persian king 500 miles away in its capital city of Susa, gets word from his brother Hanani, and he asks him, well, how are things going in Jerusalem? And Nehemiah hears the report. The walls are still broken. The gates are still crumbled. Nothing's been rebuilt. And Nehemiah grieves. He recognizes there's restoration work he hopes to see done, and it brings him to tears, the scripture says. And chapter 1 tells us that in his grief, then he turns to the spiritual disciplines of prayer and fasting, and he begins to cry out to God for help, to ask God to listen. He confesses to God how the brokenness came, that the people of God had disobeyed, that they deserved being kicked out of the land like God had warned them about. But he asks that he would have favor as he begins to try to do some of the practical restorative work of the law of the walls of Jerusalem. I didn't read it last week, but there's a closing phrase at the end of chapter 1, just after Nehemiah has prayed to God, that simply says about Nehemiah, I was cupbearer to the king. This is a role that Nehemiah held. And some of us understand in the ancient world what this looked like. There were kings that were always afraid that everybody was out to kill them. It happened often enough that fear was substantial. And so they had people like one who would be the cupbearer that would bring them their food, that would bring them their wine, that would test things before the king would eat them to make sure that they weren't poisoned. And that's part of the function of his role. But there's other things that come along with being cupbearer that aren't so bluntly stated. Because Nehemiah was cupbearer, he would have known all of the proper royal protocol for working with the king of Persia. He would have known if he was brought into a room who he was supposed to bow to, or who he was supposed to salute, who he was supposed to say something to, and who he was supposed to ignore. He would have known what trumpet blasts would mean the king is about to enter, what trumpet blasts mean the king is ready to leave, what songs would be played, when the jesters would come in, who would sing and stand, and who should and who shouldn't. He's the kind of person who, if you were told you got to come and have a meeting with the king, you would want him to give you the instructions. He knows all the formal protocol of what's supposed to take place in the presence of the king. And that's something we're going to see as important throughout chapter 2 as it begins. It begins this way. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. A couple things that stand out from this verse. First is the timing. We can read things like in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, and it means very little to us. If we look back a chapter, that one began in the month of Kislev in the 20th year. We don't recognize in our calendars a lot of what that means, and so I'll break it down for you. It's likely saying that when Nehemiah got the news from his brother, it was November. And now it's something like March or April. It's been about 4 months since Nehemiah got the news. Nehemiah's been mourning and grieving and praying for 4 months or so. And our best guess, even though it's not clearly stated, is that in those 4 months, he wasn't bringing the king his cup. He wasn't doing his official role. He was grieving. And his grief and his mourning and his hopes left him not just emotionally in an awkward place or sad, as it will say. It left him unable to physically do the things he normally did. We understand that the initial shock season of grief can do that it can overwhelm our thoughts and our emotions and our spirit and our body to a place where we don't know how to function in daily life. And many of us know that while that season begins with grief, it often is followed by a new season of grief. The grief doesn't end, but we return to a place where the daily functions of life happen again, where our spirit and our body and our soul aren't as overwhelmed. And so we carry the grief with us differently, and we return to daily function. For Nehemiah, this took 4 months, but that's not a schedule. There's no plan for how long the grief is supposed to last in each of its seasons, and we recognize that it changes based on what the grief was for. We recognize, for instance, that we may grieve if a boyfriend or girlfriend of 3 months breaks up with us, and that we would grieve very differently if a spouse of 30 years asks for a divorce. That what we're grieving changes the length the seasons of grief may last. We understand this with death as well. I only ever had fish as pets, and so if one of my 3 fish died, the grief was pretty short. Maybe I was just cold-hearted emotionless, but I didn't form a huge bond with any of the fish. It's different, I know, for people who lost one of their 3 dogs. And different, we would acknowledge even again, if somebody lost one of their 3 kids. But the way grief hits us, we can't be prepared for, and it's not scheduled. It often starts with a season that overwhelms our emotions and our spirit and our body to where the daily functions of life seem normal. But at some point, we don't know how long that is, for Nehemiah 4 months, we return to a different stage of grief, where we have now carried it with us, but return to some of the other functions of life. Nehemiah, it said, is returned to those functions. Wine was brought to him, and so he took the wine and gave it to the king. And then it says, I had not been sad in his presence before. It continues. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart. And you'll see a pattern of this. There's weird verse breaks throughout chapter 2. It gives us the beginning of the next sentence as well. I was very much afraid. We can be tempted in our society to read these verses and think, man, Nehemiah must have been a really happy, jovial guy. He had done his job the whole time. The king had never once seen him sad. And King Artaxerxes must be a really compassionate kind of guy. One of his workers comes in and he immediately knows something's changed, something's different, and that it's not even just physical. There's an emotional thing going on. He cries out, there's got to be sadness of the heart. What a wonderful, compassionate boss. And we'd be wrong. It is highly doubtful that Nehemiah was always happy and joyful, and it is highly doubtful that King Artaxerxes was noticing one of his employees look a little downcast and was compassionate. What probably really stuck out was that protocol wasn't being followed. You see, in the presence of the king in the ancient world, you were always just supposed to affirm them that things were going well. You're supposed to show up with a smile on your face and happy and do your job. They're not supposed to have any reason to talk to you or be of concern except for you functioning what you're supposed to function. And so when it says Nehemiah has never been sad in his presence before, it's not because he hadn't been sad in his time serving under the king. It's because he knew protocol was to show up and do his job and make the king happy all the time. He couldn't anymore. And King Artaxerxes notices not because he's compassionate, but because nobody is ever sad in his presence, save for the excuse he gives. The only time people don't look happy in front of me is when they're sick. He says, but you're not sick. Why does your face look sad? This must be sadness of the heart. And so Nehemiah, it says, is afraid. I think he's afraid for 2 reasons. First, he recognizes normal protocol isn't being followed. The king's not supposed to stop and talk to him about his emotions. He's supposed to watch him drink the wine and then take it. Nehemiah recognizes the attention that's been put on him is unique and is not following protocol. But he also knows what he's about to ask the king for. If you remembered, he had prayed to God that he would have favor when he met with the king because he was going to ask for success in some things. And Nehemiah knows the history that we often miss because it's chapters away and in a book of the Bible that we have as a different name. It's from the book of Ezra. In the book of Ezra, we see some of the decisions King Artaxerxes has already made. Here's what happens in chapter 4. A letter is written to the king. It's written by the governors of the people who live in the area of Jerusalem. It's known as the Trans-Euphrates area, and this is what they say in their letter. It starts in verse 12. The king should know that the people who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem, and they're rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They're restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Verse 13 through 16 gives the rest of the letter, but this is essentially what they say to the king. They say, King Artaxerxes, here's what we recommend. Go to your library, do some research, look in the annals of your kings, and what you will find is that the people who used to live here, they established a kingdom. And they taxed their people and got tributes from their people and developed armies and interacted with the nations around them. And when they did not support other empires. They didn't give money to the Egyptians or the Assyrians or the Babylonians, and if you let them rebuild, they won't give money to you either. You're going to have rebels on your hands. We just want to let you know that's what they're trying to do. Artaxerxes responds to the commanding officers and the secretaries and the rest of their associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in the Trans-Euphrates, greetings. The letter you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. And so I issued an order, and a search was made, and it was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings. It's been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. Now, issue an order to these men to stop work so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests? Nehemiah is grieving because it's been 70 years and nobody's rebuilt the walls. And yet he's going to the king who had issued a decree that says, it's not in the interest of my kingdom for those walls to get rebuilt. Stop that work from happening. And Nehemiah is standing before him, and the king looks at him and says, why are you sad? Why is protocol broken? And Nehemiah, it says, is afraid. Because Nehemiah knows cupbearers aren't safe. His own history, the story of Joseph, tells us that cupbearers get sent to prison for disobedience as well. They get rebelled, they get killed and beheaded because of the things that they've done. Nehemiah is standing in front of a king, and he essentially wants to say, I want to do that thing you said should never be done. Will you let me? He responds first with just the simple phrase in verse 3, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. He's addressing the first part of his fear. He's returning to protocol. I'm not here because I'm upset with you. I'm not here to try to get your kingdom with you. I want to celebrate you are. I'm happy to be here. May you live forever. Your kingdom's fine. He's following protocol, but then he continues, if you want to know why I'm sad, here's why. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed in fire? The entirety of the ancient world, including the Persian Empire, would have valued the graves of ancestors. So he's saying, I'm sad because my ancient ruins of my people are destroyed. And so the king said to me, what is it that you want? And then again, one of the weird breaks, we get half of the next sentence as part of this verse as well. Then I prayed to the God of heaven. Nehemiah is afraid. And he's standing in front of the king. And the protocol's been broken. And the king has looked at him square in the eyes and says, so what is it that you want? And I imagine Nehemiah takes a big breath and pause of fear pretending to have confidence as he moves forward. And it says there that he prayed to the God of heaven. Doesn't tell us what he prayed. I imagine it's a short prayer. I imagine it's not even as lengthy as the one that he prayed in chapter 1. I imagine it went something like the king saying, what is it that you want? And while he was taking that deep breath inside his head and from his spirit deeply, he uttered, Lord, help me. God, help me. And then he answered the king. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. Remember that letter you wrote, that decision you made, not just for your kingdom, but that you dispersed to the governors of all the people in the area? Let me go and do that thing you stopped. Let me go and do that thing. I'm asking for a leave of absence for work. I'm asking for permission to go against your order and rebuild that area. Nehemiah asks for help. I don't know about you, but for me, that's hard to do. Live in a world and in a culture that has always said doing things on our own and with more hard work is what's best. Pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and just putting the effort forward is what's best. That we're not supposed to be the ones who have to ask for help. We're supposed to be able to figure out how to do it on our own. That's the American dream. We can take ownership and find success through the work of our hands. And yet Nehemiah's example, and in fact the example of most of Scripture, is to say, no, it's appropriate to ask for help. First ask God, like Nehemiah did in chapter 1, and then ask those around you for help. And yet, we often don't. We often find pride in doing it ourselves. We often find pressure to perform or a felt weakness if we have to reach outside of ourselves. Last week, I hoped we'd be led, and I hope you were found and able to identify some areas in your life that need restoration. Maybe physical things that literally need to be rebuilt, like Nehemiah is happening. Maybe spiritual things, emotional things, relationship things, just areas you recognize that you're grieving and that you want to see restoration work happening. A follow-up question to that, based on Nehemiah's example today, is what should we be asking for help with? And who should we be asking? Maybe that help comes in the form of expertise we don't have, and so we reach to somebody who has knowledge we don't. Maybe it comes in the hope of provision that we don't have, and so we reach to somebody who has resources we don't. Maybe it's in the emotional companionship we don't have or know how to advocate for, and so it's a therapist we reach out to for help. The example of Nehemiah and all of Scripture is that we should be comfortable asking for help, and yet our culture fights against it. It says, do it alone. You're weak if you need help. I was raised that way, not like parented that way. I just assumed that from the culture around us, that I'm supposed to be somebody who can provide help, but I'm never supposed to need to ask for it. That I'm supposed to be someone who can offer services but never need to receive any of them. And this had started to affect my spiritual life. As I gave my life to Christ, I recognized that I was somebody who was supposed to be able to serve others but never be served. And God had to do deep work in my life to show me how faulty of an understanding that is, how unbiblical of an understanding that is, and how far from ever getting into right relationship with God I would be if I remained in that understanding. To get me to a place where I recognized that the most important decision any of us ever makes is to cry out to God for help. Help that comes to us through the grace of Jesus Christ and what he did on the cross for us. That it comes from that and that alone. We cannot earn it. We cannot provide ourselves. We cannot work ourselves. We cannot obey ourselves into right relationship with God. It is a gift we receive from Christ. And it was work I had stood against. It was work that I rebelled from. It was deep inside of me. I can remember two specific experiences that showed me how much God had to do this work in me. And the first of those is when my wife and I had decided we wanted to add to our family a child. Through the process of aiming to do so, we recognized it wasn't happening in the way we desired, and so we began testing. Through that testing, what we found out was I was the issue. I was the reason we couldn't get pregnant. And I became aware that the only way I would ever have a child, that the only way my wife would ever have a child, that the only way my parents would ever have grandchildren from me was if I was able to ask somebody to give me theirs. I could not provide one. It had to come from beyond me. And God began to do a deep work in my heart on being okay with the fact that I would have to ask for something I could not do. And it was a work then that he completed in adoption for that scenario, but it didn't fully complete it and transform it in my soul. I thought maybe it would have. God did amazing work, and I came to an understanding where I could competently and profoundly and bluntly and through microphones tell people the most significant decision we ever make is to ask for help that comes from Christ to us. It's to receive help. And yet, it was still really hard for me to ask for help. I reckon this is a couple years later, right as I started this church, some of you may remember, I tore my Achilles tendon. For 6 weeks, I couldn't walk, couldn't place weight on my right leg, couldn't drive myself anywhere. I was reliant on help for lots of things. And so I had to get used to asking for help. And I got used to it, at least in asking for help for necessities and getting myself to work. Or other people getting me to work, I think is more appropriate. In getting trays from restaurants from the counter to a table. Necessities that I just simply couldn't do, and so I had to get comfortable asking other people to help me, at times even strangers. And so I got more comfortable with that when it was a necessity. When it was just something I wanted and didn't know if I needed, I wasn't always still comfortable asking for help. I was sharing a story with the family just a couple of days ago, reminded of this. I can remember a day sitting on the couch in our house and deciding I wanted chips and salsa. And so I got up and I crutched myself into the kitchen to the cupboard where the bowls were, and I pulled the bowl down from the cupboard and placed it on the counter. And then got on the crutches again to go across the kitchen to the refrigerator, where I would open the door and place a jar of salsa under my arm and crutch it back over to the counter to set it down, unscrew its lid, pour some salsa into the bowl, put the lid back on, place it under my arm, crutch it back to the refrigerator, crutch over to the cabinet that would have the chips in it, place the bag of chips under my arm, crutch them over, place them on the counter next to the bowl of salsa. And then to look at those two things and think, I can't get them to the couch. And for a moment to debate if I would just not eat it, because I didn't want to have to ask for help. I didn't. I crutched myself back to a couch and had to cry out to my wife, Jenny, can you bring me the chips and salsa I just made for myself so that I could eat them? And in those moments, for whatever reason, because of what was deep inside of me, it's hard to ask for help. Some of us are aware of things in our life that need to be restored. And we are aware that God has invited us to join him in that work of restoration. And yet we sit or stand with fear about what that work would look like and frozen by our inability to ask for help. Nehemiah asks for help. And the king says in verse 6, with the queen sitting beside him, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? And it pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Nehemiah gets permission. The king grants him the leave of absence. He essentially reverses his first order and says, go ahead, tell me how long it will take. And as the help is offered, Nehemiah gets a little more confident, maybe moving from his fear into a place with a little more courage and boldness. He asks for more blunt things. Verse 7, and so I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe contact until I arrive in Judah? Remember all those people who wrote you the letters saying to stop the building thing, who said it was trouble, who said it was done by people who would rebel? Could you write me letters for them so that they're not concerned about what I'm doing? And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so he will give me the timber to make the beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy? Essentially, it went like this. Out of fear, Lord, help me. And then he asked, can I have a leave of absence to go rebuild the walls? And the king says, how long do you need? Go ahead. And so then he says, oh, well, then can you grant me safe transportation? And by the way, will you pay for it? Will you give me the wood from your parks? Not from the people of God, not from what we had saved and stashed. Will you give me the Persian timber from your royal parks that I can rebuild? And it says, and because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. We have a temptation, no different than to read King Artaxerxes as the compassionate one at the beginning of the story. Once in this story or in our own lives, we have a temptation to see the practical and physical things working out and think it's simply because we put effort in and practical and physical things are happening. And yet Nehemiah is reminded and is aware of what he has been praying for 4 months. Favor from God. And so when favorable things start to happen, he immediately recognizes it was because the gracious hand of his God was on him. And there's an awareness Nehemiah has that I wish we would all have the insight to have in every moment. That the physical things that are going well in our lives are usually also deeply and profoundly spiritual things. We tend to separate them. But Nehemiah says, no, a leave of absence from work, a letter to take some governors, and some wood are a deeply spiritual thing, and they are the sign that the gracious hand of my God is on me. In our lives, often practical things have deep spiritual implication and impact. It's why Jesus says it's important for us to do things like share cups of water. Because those acts of love can have deeply spiritual impact in people's lives as they see that as an act of love and are then pointed to God because of it. Practical things with deep spiritual impacts. As we look to restore, it is often practical things we engage with. And that as God's gracious hand is on them, they take on deep spiritual impact as restoration happens. And so it continues in verse 9. So I went to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates, and I gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. He went above and beyond what Nehemiah had bluntly asked for. And so he got permission to leave. He got transportation through and protection from authority. He got it paid for. And he got a small troop to go with him. And I'd love to say that the things we identify in our own life that need restoration will always go just so smoothly as well. That we'll ask for a few things, our fears will be resolved, we'll have confidence, and we'll boldly proclaim that the gracious hand of God is on us, and we will find favor in all that we do. And while God does promise that he will continue to work for good for us, he does not promise it will always be easy. Nehemiah will experience through the rest of the story we'll see in the coming weeks. It is not always easy, and that is foreshadowed in the one verse that remains before the context shifts to Jerusalem. In verse 10, when it says, when Sanballat and the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Sanballat and Tobiah are names you will hear throughout Nehemiah's story. Nehemiah seeks to restore something, and the moment the work begins, there are people who rise up to say, I do not want to see that restored. I want to dig my heels in. I want to fight. I am against that. And the same may be true, unfortunately, for us. When we aim for restoration, not everybody will like that. Not everybody will receive it well. Some people will dig their heels in. Some people will prepare for battle. Some people will bluntly oppose. Nehemiah is aware of that. And so while we don't see it at this point in chapter 2, we recognize that when he asks for help from the king and favor is extended, that's far from the end of the help he'll have to ask for. He'll end up having to ask every family in Jerusalem that claims relationship with God for help. Every single one of them. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of family, Nehemiah will have to say, will you help this project come to restoration? And what we'll see is that it will. Because of the practical help of people combined with the gracious hand of God who favors his people. It means the opposition can be overcome. And so I don't know what the thing is in your life you've identified that needs to be restoration, or maybe it's a list of them. Practical things, physical things, relational things, emotional things, deep spiritual wounds that you have, where you just are grieving and recognizing that it's broken and it's wrong and that hurts your spirit. But maybe you're entering a season where your grief moves to a new stage and you are invited to start returning to practical work again alongside a God who, in your fear, in your lack of comfort, in your lack of confidence, or in the face of opposition, comes alongside you and says, because my gracious hand is on you, we will see restoration happen. You may have to ask for help, first for God's favor and then from others, for expertise, for provision, for companionship, whatever it may be. You may have to ask for help, but as you do, the gracious hand of God is on you, and those seemingly physical and practical things will be embedded with deep spiritual power because of the Spirit of God he has placed inside of you. And those deeply spiritual things will do restorative work even in the face of people who don't want restoration to happen. That's what God invites us towards. That's what Nehemiah models. It's what Jesus modeled for us. That with the hand of God on your side, restoration happens through the work that you do. My hope is that that would be true in the areas that we have identified. And so I want to pray for that. And I want to invite you to join me in that prayer. God, we recognize brokenness. Brokenness in our own lives, brokenness in our communities, brokenness in our church, brokenness in our country, brokenness in the world. Lots of things that need restoration, and some of those things to each of us personally grieve us. We're aware of them uniquely, and so I pray that we would recognize that that's an invitation for us to join you in works of restoration. And that as we have ability to move from a season of grief and shock into a season of grief that allows us to function again, that we would start doing the practical steps of restoration, that would start with prayer, that it would start with seeking your favor, that it would continue with a willingness to ask for help where we need it. And that when those things begin to happen, when favor is expressed through practical or spiritual things, we would always recognize it as being your hand at work. And that when opposition steps in front of us, we would still recognize your hand at work. And we would continue to do practical restorative steps like cups of water, bricks of stone, forgiving conversations, confession, whatever it looks like. That combining those steps with your Spirit that's within us, we would get to a place where we too celebrate the restorative work that you do. Help us to see that. Help us to be obedient to that. We know it doesn't happen in our strength and in our power, and so we pray your presence in and through us, and we ask it then in Jesus' name. Amen. As you go today, I hope you go with an understanding that the gracious hand of God goes with you, that his favor is there with you, that he wants to work for good in your life, and he's inviting you to restorative work alongside him. Before you go, feel free to have a conversation or introduce yourself to somebody else who has the favor of God on them as well. Go with grace and peace this morning. You are dismissed.